So our app so far is looking pretty good. We've got our list of books here. It took a little bit of code to get here, well, kind of a lot of code that looked kind of confusing, but we do have our list of books. There's just one problem right now. Our books reducer always returns the same list of books. So in other words, our application state is always the same. It's 100% static. We don't have the ability to change that state over time. In a little bit, we're going to want to be able to introduce the concept of an active book. And as you might imagine, the active book needs to be able to change as the user clicks on different buttons. So that's really a piece of our application state that needs to change over time. It's a dynamic piece of our application state. Changing our state is what actions and action creators are for. So I'm going to pull a diagram on the screen that we're going to walk through to help us understand actions and action creators a little bit more. Now this diagram is a little bit crazy, but just bear with me for a little bit. We're going to go through it step by step. So this is the diagram of the life cycle of an action in a Redux application. Everything in a Redux application, well, most everything, starts off with an event triggered by a user, either directly or indirectly. This event could be them, say, clicking on a button, like a book over here, selecting an item from a drop-down, or hovering on a particular element. But it could also be kind of more indirect things, like say a AJAX request finishing loading up, or a page initially loading up, the actual web page finishing loading. All of these events can optionally call an action creator. An action creator is a function that returns an action. In this diagram, let's look at the top flow here right now. We've got book number 2. So let's say that whenever the button here, book number 2, is clicked, we choose, because we do have to define this, is something that we're going to specifically define. Whenever a user clicks on button number 2, it's going to call an action creator. The action creator is just a function that returns an object. So you can see right here we've got our function and it returns an object. We'll talk about what's going on inside the object here in just a little bit, but let's just ignore that step for right now. So the action creator returns an object. That object is then automatically sent to all the different reducers inside of our application. So it doesn't matter, we might have 20 different reducers. All of these actions are going to flow through all of those reducers. Reducers can choose, depending on the action, to return a different piece of state depending on what the action is. That newly returned piece of state then gets piped into the application state, and that application state then gets pumped back into our React application, which causes all of our components to re-render. Okay, so with one run through there, let's go through it again, but in greater detail. So let's say that whenever a user clicks on this button, book number 2, we call an action creator. And don't worry, we'll go through the process of setting up that action creator entirely, but just bear with me for a little bit. So again, they click on number 2 and it calls an action creator. The action creator is a function that returns an object. The object has a type that describes the type of action that was just triggered. So in this case, we might have a type of, say, book selected. The action can also have some data that further describes the action. And in this case, we've got a property on here, book, that contains the actual selected book. In this case, the book with title of book 2. Kind of a boring book, I guess, whatever. So the action creator returns that object, and the actual object itself is our actual action. It's what we call an action. The action is automatically sent to all of the reducers inside of our application. What we'll usually do inside of all our different reducers, and we'll do this in a little bit, is set up a switch statement inside of our reducers. And the switch statement will basically go to a different line depending on the type of the action. So you can see in the code here, we do a switch on action.type, and if the book is selected, or if in the case that the action's type is book selected, we will return action.book, which in this case would be like the book that we just clicked on. a reducer doesn't have to react to every different action. It can say like, I don't care anything about the current action at all, like doesn't matter to me. In which case, it just returns its current state and no state is changed for that particular reducer. If the reducer does care about the action, it can return something, and that newly returned value will be the new value of state. So in this particular case here, for the book selected type of action, the action will flow into the reducer here. We'll do a switch on action.type. If the action type is book selected, the reducer will return action.book. So the book that was dispatched with the action up here, right? So basically the book with title 2. Because this active book reducer is wired up to the active book key on our state, and we haven't wired that up yet, we are going to do that very shortly, it pops up as the new value of the state. So whatever is returned from this reducer ends up as the new value of the state. So in this case, this title JavaScript might be a little bit misleading. In this case, it would actually be title book 2. Once all of the reducers have processed the action and chosen to return state or said, no, I don't care about that action, I'm just going to return my current state, that newly assembled action, or excuse me, newly assembled state gets pumped back into all the different containers, and then all the different containers will run that function that we defined in the last section. You remember the map state to props. So that will rerun. That state will get dissected, injected into all the different containers, and all those containers will re-render with all their data. So that's basically the entire flow, right? Once that re-render finishes, our application is then sitting there waiting for the user to trigger another event. When they trigger another event, we go through the entire process again. We call an action creator, it returns an action, the action flows to the reducers assemble our new state, and the new state flows into all the containers. All right, so based on a diagram alone, this is kind of confusing to understand. So let's go ahead and get to work putting together the concept of our active book in the next section.